June 3rd, 2026, 6:30 in the morning, Kuwait City. The check-in queues are forming at Terminal 1. Kuwait International Airport is one of the busiest transit hubs in the Gulf, roughly 15 million passengers a year, connecting Asia to Europe, moving cargo, oil workers, diplomats, families. It's one of those airports that never really sleeps. Then the drones arrive. Iranian drones struck Terminal 1. One person was killed. 63 were wounded. The airport closed. Kuwait Airways moved what flights it could to Terminal 4. The IRGC released footage of the strikes. Kuwait's foreign ministry called it a brutal attack on civilian infrastructure. CENTCOM said the damage was deliberate, calculated, and unjustified. Hours earlier, the same morning, the U.S. Navy had struck a military ground control station on Qeshm Island, an Iranian military facility in the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM described it as a self-defense strike in response to Iranian attacks on U.S. destroyers transiting the strait. Trump called it a measured response. Iran called it a violation of the ceasefire. So, here's the question the headline doesn't answer. Why Kuwait? Kuwait didn't strike Qeshm. Kuwait's military had nothing to do with the Qeshm operation. Kuwait's government has been trying to stay out of this war since February 28th. It spent years building diplomatic relationships with Tehran, maintained open embassies, told Iran repeatedly that Kuwaiti territory would not be used as a launchpad against the Islamic Republic. Kuwait's leaders watched the opening strikes on February 28th with the same dread as everyone else in the Gulf who hadn't asked for this war. None of that mattered on June 3rd. A Kuwaiti citizen working at the airport died. 63 people were taken to hospitals. The terminal was burning. By the end of this video, you will understand the doctrine behind that strike, what Iran is actually trying to accomplish, why Kuwait is not a mistake or an accident in Iran's campaign, and what the answer to that question tells you about how this conflict ends and who blinks first. Start with what Kuwait actually is, in military terms, because this is where most coverage skips a step. Kuwait is not a bystander. Kuwait hosts approximately 13,500 U.S. troops, the single largest American military presence anywhere in the Middle East. Camp Arifjan in southern Kuwait is the headquarters for U.S. Army Central, the command that coordinates land operations across the entire CENTCOM area of responsibility, from Egypt to Afghanistan. Everything that moves, soldiers, equipment, supplies, flows through Camp Arifjan. It's the logistical spine of U.S. ground operations in the region. Ali al-Salam Air Base, near the Iraqi border, is a transit and support hub for coalition aircraft. American, British, Italian, and Canadian forces have all operated from there. On April 6, 2026, 15 Americans were wounded in an Iranian drone strike on Ali al-Salam, Camp Buehring in Kuwait's northeast. Stages U.S. Army units moving through the theater. An Iranian F-5 fighter penetrated Camp Buehring's defenses in a bombing run that the Pentagon didn't acknowledge publicly until weeks later. Kuwait International Airport itself is, in Iran's assessment, a dual-use facility. Civilian terminal on one side, coalition military transport and logistics on the other. U.S. military personnel transit through it. Equipment moves through its cargo terminals. Iran lists it as part of the coalition infrastructure that enables American operations against Iranian forces. The airport was already targeted on the first day of the war, February 28th, when an initial Iranian drone struck Terminal 1 and injured several airport employees. That wasn't an accident or a calibration error. It was a statement of targeting intent. Iran has hit the airport multiple times since. Fuel tanks set ablaze in late March. Another fuel tank fire in April with no casualties, and then June 3rd, the worst strike yet. The pattern shows a deliberate, progressive campaign against the same facility, each attack slightly more damaging than the last. Iran's foreign ministry made its position explicit in the opening days of the war. Any country that allows its territory to be used for attacks against Iran will be considered a legitimate target. The IRGC said the same thing, in different words, repeatedly. Every strike on Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia has been framed this way, not as aggression against a neutral neighbor, but as retaliation against a host nation that chose sides by hosting American forces. Here is what Iran is actually trying to do with the Kuwait strikes. And it is not what it looks like on the surface. Iran cannot defeat the U.S. Navy in open combat. That's not a close question. Iran's surface fleet is outclassed by every metric: tonnage, firepower, sensors, aircraft. A conventional naval engagement between Iranian and American forces ends one way. Iran knows this. The IRGC has known it since the 1980s. The entire Iranian asymmetric doctrine, the mine warfare, the mosquito fleet, the coastal missile batteries, is built around the premise that you don't fight on your enemy's terms when your enemy wins on those terms. The same logic applies to the Gulf campaign. Iran cannot bomb the U.S. out of the Gulf in a direct strike exchange. What it can do is make the Gulf states' calculation change. The Defense Security Asia analysis from June 3rd described the drone doctrine precisely. Iran's campaign centers on exhausting defensive readiness cycles through sustained attritional pressure, not one decisive blow. A grinding, persistent campaign that forces Gulf air defense systems to operate continuously, burns through interceptor missiles, keeps populations in a state of alert fatigue, and raises the cost of every economic activity that depends on Gulf stability. A civilian airport is a particularly efficient target for this kind of pressure. When Terminal 1 is on fire, insurance underwriters in London raise aviation premiums for the entire Gulf. Airlines reroute. Foreign business travelers delay visits or cancel entirely. Investment decisions get pushed back. Shipping conferences move locations. The companies that were considering Gulf headquarters reconsider. An attack on one terminal, in one airport, sends an economic signal that radiates through every sector that depends on Gulf accessibility. That is not a side effect of the strategy. That is the strategy. Iran's goal is not to destroy Kuwait. It's to make Kuwait, and every other Gulf state, run a different cost-benefit calculation about whether the relationship with Washington is worth what it costs. This is not a new idea. Go back to January 1991. Saddam Hussein's Iraq is 3 weeks into Desert Storm. The U.S.-led coalition is flying more than 2,000 sorties a day out of bases in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE. The air campaign has already destroyed most of the Iraqi Air Force on the ground. Saddam cannot fight the coalition in the air. His remaining aircraft are either hiding or flying to Iran to sit out the war. He cannot win on those terms. So, he turns to the Scud. Between January 18th and February 26th, 1991, Iraq fires 46 Scud missiles at Saudi Arabia, at Tehran, at Riyadh, at military bases where coalition forces are concentrated. Patriot batteries intercept some get through. On February 25th, a Scud hits a U.S. barracks in Tehran. 28 American soldiers are killed. It is the single deadliest attack on U.S. forces in the entire Gulf War. The strategic logic was the same as what Iran is executing now, 4 decades later. Saddam could not beat the coalition in a direct engagement, but he could impose a cost on the host nations, Saudi Arabia above all, that made their governments feel the weight of American wars fought from their soil. The hope was that enough incoming fire would fracture the Arab participation in the coalition, push Gulf governments toward pressure for a ceasefire or a minimum signal to every Arab capital that sheltering the Americans had real consequences. Saudi Arabia stayed in the coalition. The war ended on February 28, 1991, 43 days after the air campaign began. Saddam's Scuds did not change the outcome. But here is the part that matters for 2026. Saudi Arabia's bet on the U.S. was vindicated only because the U.S. finished the job quickly. 43 days. The coalition was decisive, the campaign was fast, and the Saudi government never had to face a situation where the war dragged on long enough for its own population to demand a different answer. That's the condition the Gulf states are waiting on right now, and nobody knows when it arrives. The Gulf governments didn't want this war. That is not a point that requires argument. It's confirmed by every major analysis of the opening phase of the conflict. Saudi Arabia had signed a Chinese-brokered normalization agreement with Iran in 2023. Embassies reopened. Diplomatic traffic resumed. The Saudis spent years telling Tehran that the kingdom was not looking for confrontation, and that Saudi soil would not be a launchpad against the Islamic Republic. Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE did the same, maintaining consulates, keeping communication channels open, insisting that their territories were off limits for offensive operations. All of that was true, formally speaking. None of it protected them from Iranian strikes once the war started, because Iran's problem isn't with Kuwaiti foreign policy. Iran's problem is with the bases. Fawaz Gerges at the London School of Economics described the Gulf states' calculation precisely. They face a choice between the immediate threat of Iranian strikes and the far greater risk of being pulled deeper into a war they didn't start and can't control. Their response has been calculated restraint, defending their own airspace, signaling red lines, but not formally joining the U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran. The result is a situation where the Gulf states are absorbing Iranian fire generated by American operations, without having asked for those operations, while being unable to publicly oppose them without fracturing relationships with Washington that are also the basis of their security. It's a position with no clean exit. Ask the Americans to leave, and you lose the protection shield and the security guarantee that has underwritten Gulf development for 50 years. Keep the Americans, and you keep absorbing Iranian strikes that are specifically designed to make that choice unbearable. Bernard Haeckel at Princeton said the core issue plainly. If Iran's ability to threaten the Gulf is not addressed, the danger becomes long-term. The Gulf states can absorb strikes for months. The question is whether they can absorb them indefinitely while maintaining the open, internationally connected economies that are the basis of everything they've built. Kuwait has been hit at its airport since the first day of the war, February 28th, when an initial drone struck Terminal 1 with minor damage. Then, March 25th, when a drone set fuel tanks ablaze. Then, April 1st, when fuel tanks at Kuwait Aviation's fueling company burned. Then, June 3rd, the worst attack yet. 1 dead, 63 wounded, Terminal 1 heavily damaged. Each attack is a message. You're still hosting them. The price goes up. Think about what that means in economic terms for a country built on the Gulf's model. Kuwait International Airport moves 15 million passengers a year. Oil workers, business executives, foreign investors, conference attendees, tourists. The entire connective tissue of a service and energy economy flows through that terminal. When the terminal is burning, that traffic doesn't just slow down. Airlines invoke force majeure. Insurance underwriters invoke war clauses. Foreign companies that were thinking about Gulf offices quietly cancel the site visits. Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG facility was struck during the war, reducing the country's LNG export capacity by roughly 17%, a loss that analysts expect to persist for 3 to 5 years because of the specific infrastructure that was damaged. Saudi Aramco facilities at Ras Tanura were hit. The U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain faces repair estimates of $200 million from Iranian strikes. The Iranian F-5 bombing run at Camp Waring damaged infrastructure that wasn't publicly disclosed for weeks. Every one of these attacks targets the same underlying assumption, that the Gulf is a stable, open, commercially accessible environment where the rules apply and the infrastructure holds. Foreign companies are in the Gulf because the airports work, the ports run, and the streets are safe. Iranian strikes don't have to destroy that reputation permanently to do strategic damage. They just have to create enough uncertainty that the margin of confidence thins. That uncertainty is worth more to Iran than the physical damage from any individual strike. The physical damage can be repaired. The recalculation that happens in a corporate boardroom in Singapore or Frankfurt. The one where someone says, let's revisit the Gulf headquarters plan after the war settles. That's the real target. The question coming out of June 3rd is not whether Kuwait will close U.S. bases. It won't, not today. The Kuwaiti government has too much at stake in the American security relationship to make that move unilaterally, and Iran knows it. The question is more gradual and more dangerous. At what point does the accumulated cost of hosting those bases exceed what any Gulf government can sustain politically without demanding something in return from Washington? A faster conclusion, a different posture, a ceasefire on terms Iran finds acceptable? Iran's strategy is to push every Gulf host nation toward that calculation, not by winning a single decisive battle, but by keeping the pressure continuous, rotating targets so no single country absorbs all of it, and making each new strike slightly worse than the last one to signal that the trajectory only goes one direction. The U.S. counter-strategy is to degrade Iranian strike capability fast enough that the Gulf states never reach that tipping point, to make the war short enough that the Gulf's bet on American protection is vindicated, the way Saudi Arabia's bet was vindicated in 43 days in 1991. The 2026 war started February 28th. It is not 43 days old. A ceasefire was negotiated and has been tested repeatedly. Negotiations in Islamabad have produced nothing conclusive. The Qeshm strike and the Kuwait airport attack on June 3rd happened inside a ceasefire that both sides claim is still technically in effect. The Gulf states are watching the pace. They are watching whether American operations are compressing Iran's strike capability or just absorbing it. They are watching their own populations watching the airport footage and asking what the war is for and when it ends. Iran is watching the same thing. Every cycle of Qeshm to Kuwait, every barracks hit and terminal burned, is testing whether the calculation tips. Whether the Gulf states stay in 1991 Saudi Arabia mode, absorbing the scuds, holding the line, waiting for the Americans to finish, or whether the duration of this war eventually produces a different answer. Saddam's scuds didn't work in 1991, but the 2026 war is not Desert Storm. Desert Storm was a defined military objective: remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait, executed by a coalition with air superiority, a clear mandate, and political unity that didn't crack. It was over in 43 days because it was designed to be over in 43 days. The 2026 campaign is more complicated. It started as strikes on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. It's now involved in a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, ceasefire negotiations in Islamabad that have produced no binding agreement, and an ongoing exchange of strikes that both sides are calling retaliation for the other side's actions. There's no announced end state, no publicly declared condition that the U.S. would accept as victory. The Gulf states absorbing Iranian fire are absorbing it without a clear timeline for when the protection they're buying actually protects them. That's the difference. Saudi Arabia in 1991 knew Desert Storm was going to end soon. The Gulf states in 2026 don't know when this war ends. Write close or hold in the comments. Do the Gulf states eventually close U.S. bases, deciding the Iranian strikes aren't worth the protection they're buying? Or do they hold the line long enough for the U.S. to end this, the way Saudi Arabia held in 1991 and the bet paid off? Two words, two different conclusions about where this goes. I read every one.